Welcome to the Advanced Freelancing Podcast. Every week, you'll hear strategies for building your online service-based business your way. And now, here's your host, veteran freelancer, author, and TEDx speaker, Laura Briggs.
Welcome back to another episode of the Advanced Freelancing Podcast. If we haven't met before, I am Laura Briggs, a 7-year veteran freelancer, and today I'm talking about one of the topics that I am most passionate about. And I'll tell you why. I'm talking about toxic clients, and this really matters because not only have I worked with toxic clients in my freelance business, but I've also coached many freelancers privately, and what all of them have in common is that in some way or another, they have been dealing with at least one toxic client. And that becomes a key component of what we work on together, is helping them to break out of working with that particular client and also identifying the underlying patterns that can cause you to end up with toxic clients again and again. So let's first talk about what a toxic client is. I view a toxic client as someone who literally drains all of the energy and life force out of you. They are overwhelming, they're overbearing, they have increasing levels of requests for you, usually with no extra pay, and they tend to produce emotional responses in the freelancers that they work with. So it could be frustration. You dread opening their emails and dealing with them on the phone. It could be anger, where you talk to them and you feel like you're constantly being thrown under the bus or set up for failure. Or it could just be this overwhelming sense of burnout, because unfortunately, toxic clients bring out the worst in us. This can especially be a train wreck for your business if you, on the whole, have clients that you love working with, because it will be such a stark contrast to the other clients that are on your roster. Now, if you've only ever worked with toxic clients, it might take you a while to realize that that's a pattern that you're perpetuating in your business. But recognizing the toxic client is really the first step. Is this someone who treats you poorly, who doesn't pay you well, who's always asking for discounts and reduction in price, who's always making you feel as though you don't quite deserve to work with them, even though you are giving it your hardest? Now, anyone in the freelance world can be subject to working with toxic clients, but I find that this happens a lot with writers and virtual assistants. So you can find it in other types of freelance work relationships, but virtual assistants especially tend to get taken advantage of by clients because the client wants to sort of dump everything on this one person. They want this one person to become the go-to in their business. And usually a VA is not paid as much as some other types of freelance professionals. So a writer might make more, or an online business manager might make more per hour, but a toxic client will already have that personality nature about them, and then it will get even worse when they're paying someone on an hourly basis. So it might show up with VAs by the client acting as though you could have done the work so much faster and you didn't, or they don't understand why you can't just get it with their instructions, right? And it's probably that their instructions are terrible, but there's always going to be an excuse and usually a complaint about your work. Sometimes clients will go into these relationships and set them up as retainers, and then they will ask for way more than what the VA was promising with the agreement or was even willing or capable of doing. So if you're hired as a virtual assistant to work 10 hours and the client keeps dumping more and more on you to where you're logging 15, 20, 30 hours a week, and especially if you're not being compensated for that work, that is a toxic client. So let's talk about what you do to try to flag these people before you even work with them. First of all, it is not always possible to prevent working with every single toxic client. Some of these people can sneak up on you. In fact, they can put forward a really good face, and you have no idea that they're toxic until you're deep into the relationship. This can also happen when you got hired and started working with one person on the team, but there have been changes in the team, and now you're reporting to someone new, and the new person is toxic, or the new person just doesn't have respect for you and what you do because you've never worked together before. All of these situations can get really negative really quickly and can be something where as a freelancer, you just want out. So the best course of action you can take is to be aware of some of the red flags of toxic freelance clients before you work together. And then also keep in the back of your mind, not to beat yourself up if one slips through the cracks anyways, because those situations do happen. You can have an amazing phone call with a client and write a proposal and it's easily accepted and they pay their deposit. And then 2 weeks later, they start talking to you in a completely different way. And that is when you have the opportunity to try and walk it back. And I'll talk about that in a little bit after we go over sort of reviewing some of these red flags. So my signals of toxic clients usually come out on phone calls. Sometimes a toxic client will reveal themselves in a job board post or in an email, and it's a lot easier to turn them down because there hasn't been any formal communication yet. The first red flag that I'm looking for as a prospective freelancer with a client is, how do they talk about their past freelancers? If they tell you right away, oh yeah, we've worked with 15 other graphic designers, they were all horrible and we had to fire them all. The odds that all 15 graphic designers they worked with were truly awful and unprofessional are very low. That's your first indication that it's something wrong with the client and not the freelancer. I'm willing to let a couple of bad freelancers be a reason for why the client is frustrated, but it's not likely the case that time after time after time, it's the freelancer rather than the client. So they're either hiring all the wrong people to work with them, or they're really difficult to work with and other freelancers are splitting. So a great question to ask on your phone calls with clients is, tell me about your experiences working with freelancers before. This is really important regardless of whether or not you're sort of scanning to see if there are red flags, because first of all, we want to know if they've never worked with a freelancer before. You have the opportunity to then shape them into the way that it's most effective to work with you. So if they've never worked with freelancers, they might assume that this is just kind of like another employee and they can ask you to do whatever they want. It's much easier to set up expectations from the outset of your relationship with these kinds of clients so that you can kind of teach and train them how really to be effective in giving instructions and feedback to a freelancer. The other possible response to this is that they've hired other freelancers and it hasn't worked out. So we're not going to discount somebody because they hired somebody else and it wasn't successful, but we are going to be cautious about the way that they respond about those other freelancers. If they say, that last person I hired was an idiot, so-and-so was so unprofessional, and then we hired 3 more people and they were just as bad, be very cautious about being the next person to show up on that list, right? They don't really have much of a respect for freelancers. And there's a big difference between saying, I hired this other virtual assistant and it really wasn't successful. I just don't think her communication style matched with me. And saying the last virtual assistant I hired was a complete and total nightmare. I've been burned so many times, I can't even count it, right? So those might actually be referencing the same situation, but show a lot about the client's attitude. And if they have been burned before, this is valuable for you to hear on the phone call because you can use that information to your advantage. Figure out why the relationship went south. Is it because someone didn't meet deadlines? When you're positioning yourself on the phone call, in the proposal, and in the follow-up, you can reference back to that and talk about how you always meet deadlines or how your clients are constantly remarking that they're pleased with how you meet deadlines. So all of this information can be used to your advantage, not just for the purpose of flagging those clients who might have some negative behaviors. The other thing to watch out for on phone calls with prospective toxic clients is their expectations. Are they already pushing you to be available 24/7 on Skype? Are they saying, I need to be able to call you at 10 o'clock at night and have you pick up the phone? Those might be communication issues that brush up against your boundaries. I know for me, if there's a client who's offering that, we're just not going to work together. So I like to know that kind of thing in advance where possible. And a lot of times these toxic clients will actually bring it up themselves and say, hey, this is what I expect. And you can try to redirect them, but they might be committed to whatever it is that they, think is reasonable to interact with a freelancer. Another concern with a toxic client is someone who constantly makes you prove your worth, even on the initial phone call. They're talking about nothing but ROI, and they don't want to sign a contract that's longer than a month because they don't trust you. And, they've been so hurt by other freelancers in the past. And, they'll pay you like 10% up front and the rest when they're satisfied with the completed product. Well, a lot of us freelancers, we don't work that way, right? And there's so many things that are outside of our control that I personally am not going to accept blame for everything that's going wrong in their business, even if I am doing something that's partially geared towards results. So let's say I'm writing emails for a client. If their opt-in sucks, if their landing page is terrible, if they never schedule the emails to go out, or any of those other things, like if their website is in yellow and black and it's really hard to read, none of that falls on me. So I can take responsibility for the quality of the writing provided and pretty much no other element unless I've agreed to work on it with that client. So if they're already pushing you to take responsibility for things you haven't agreed to do and don't want to do, that's another sign of a toxic client. I think communication preferences is just such a big thing with onboarding new clients because various people have different perspectives on what's fair and what's reasonable. A client might think that if they email you 3 times a day to ask about the status of something, that they're just being friendly and kind of reminding you of the situation and it's not that big of a deal. But as a freelancer, you probably don't feel like that. You probably feel like it's disruptive and that you're not getting paid for all of the time you have to go back and answer those different messages of them asking for status. If you have a client who wants to text message you and you're not comfortable with that, that's something you should bring up early on in the relationship and say, I prefer to keep everything in our project management software or in email so that there's a track of it. And that's another good thing to remember about these toxic clients is the importance of getting things in writing. If you suspect that someone is difficult to work with, we want to get everything in writing possible. Don't rely on verbal communications and promises because it's so easy for people to walk that back and say, I never said that. I never promised you that. That was never part of the deal. So regardless of whether or not you think someone is a toxic client, we always want to be able to get as much in writing as possible. So I love doing it via email. I write up all my proposals at least in a document or in an email. So there's always a paper trail because sometimes you will find these toxic clients or even like people who work for the client can actually be toxic too. They will try to throw you under the bus. And having evidence on your side is really helpful when you're in that unfortunate kind of situation. So let's talk about when you have a client that you're newly working with or where the situation has changed, somebody new has come onto the scene, and you're thinking they might be toxic or they're edging up against some of those boundaries. How do we try to address it before full on firing them? I'm a big fan of trying to fix something before throwing in the towel, unless the action on the part of the client is so terrible that I can't get over it, which has maybe happened like once in 7 years of business. So I always give people an opportunity to correct things first. And I always go in with the assumption that they did not mean to come across the way that they did. Okay. So they might have absolutely meant to come across that way, but it's nice to give them the benefit of the doubt. A lot of things can be misconstrued even over the phone, but especially in text messages, emails, and online project management tools where you're reading someone's text and you might be applying a different emotion or tone to it than they really intended. So I think the first thing to do is to try to call the situation out early on when it happens. If someone brushes up against your boundaries, you can respond in a very friendly way. Let's take the example of the client who they have your business phone number because you did a call with them and now they're texting you at 10 o'clock at night. So I would first of all ignore the message when it comes in. The next morning during business hours, I would address their concern via email and then say, by the way, my business phone is turned off and I don't respond to texts because they're too difficult to keep track of. Just reply to this message with whatever concerns you have about what I've addressed here. That's a way to help retrain them that, hey, this texting thing, that's not going to work for me. That's not what we agreed to, and I'm not going to do it. You can even do the same thing with emails. If people are trying to send you messages after the hours that you're not available, wait, don't respond, even if you see it, and respond the next day during your regular time for checking email. Sometimes this in and of itself is enough to teach a client that you're not going to go back and forth and you're not going to break your boundaries. They might even limit themselves and try not to send you messages because they know you will not reply. Now, if the client speaks to you unprofessionally, call it out in the moment as calmly as possible. I have had situations where I couldn't quite tell if it was a cultural difference. Sometimes people from different countries or even areas around the United States speak in a different way. So a great example, and I'm not trying to be shady here, but most people have interacted with someone who grew up in New York or New Jersey. Occasionally, their accents and their tone can come across as being snippy or rude. And sometimes it's completely not. It's just the way that they talk, the way that they come across is a little bit different than what you might expect from, having a conversation with someone in a different region. So there have been 2 occasions where I was on the phone with someone from one of those 2 states, and I just really felt like the conversation was going in kind of an aggressive way. And so I kind of brought it up with the client, said, I'm not sure if you mean for it to come across that way, but it sounds like you're telling me I'm not qualified at all. And I just want to address that now in the moment before we go forward. Sometimes when the client didn't mean to do that, they will go, oh no, I was joking, or I didn't know that that's the way you were going to take it. And of course you have to make a judgment call about when someone could have made a legitimate, foot in mouth situation versus when they're, trying to cover up the fact that they did that on purpose. So try to call it out as calmly and as professionally as possible. If someone is openly rude, hateful, or cursing at you, I don't even engage. I had another professional in the freelance world send me an opportunity to work with her on a product, and I kept all of our communication so professional, and her response was just filled with hatred and some really nasty statements when I declined the opportunity to work together in a really professional way. And rather than going to that level, I just said, I wish you the best of luck with your project. So you don't have to engage any further with someone who is abusive or toxic in that way. If you're in a relationship with a toxic client, I don't care how much money it is, you can't afford to stay working with them, okay? You can't. No ifs, ands, or buts. I've had coaching clients who have had $5,000 a month retainers, $20,000 agreements, $10,000 one-time projects, and the clients were completely overbearing. First of all, if you calculated the actual amount of time you spent with those clients, it probably isn't even worth it. You're probably not even getting a good hourly wage, right? And when you factor in the toll it's taking on your emotional health or even your physical health, these clients are never worth it. They will push you close to burnout. They will make you question your qualifications and your expertise and everything that you do on a regular basis. And one of the really negative aspects of working with a toxic client and sticking with it for the money is the fact that this emotional impact on you could bleed over to your other projects. So it could not only be killing the work you're doing with the toxic client, but it could also have negative impacts for all of those other clients that you work on because you're so drained and frustrated and angry at this one client that you kind of bring that over to your other working arrangements. Navigating out of a toxic relationship is always difficult, and you should start by trying to reinforce some boundaries with the client. But if that is unsuccessful and you've given them repeated chances to correct their behavior and they haven't, it's time to get out of the relationship. Even if it's gone really toxic and abusive, I still advocate for trying to keep it professional when you exit. Just say, unfortunately, this opportunity is no longer a fit for me. Here is my blah, blah, blah day notice, and allow it to go at that point. The client will likely push back. It can be a surprise. Even if they've treated you really poorly, they might deep down know what they have and they don't want to lose you. So they might push back and try to keep you. But trust me, when you have already mentally made the decision to be done with a client and you're frustrated, overwhelmed, aggravated, it's better for you and for the client for you to walk away because it's very hard to repair that situation when you don't trust them. And especially if they go right back into that behavior, and then you have to have the whole conversation over again of removing yourself from the toxic client. So make a plan for how you're going to exit the situation after you've tried to implement changes, and also be working towards marketing your efforts and put a timeline on it. Say, you know what? I don't want to work with this client 2 months from now. So I have 2 months to land a new client and replace that opportunity. Have you ever had to work with a toxic client before? And I'd love to hear how you navigated out of it. Send me an email at info@betterbizacademy.com.